In the autumn of 1666, London was a smoldering ruin. The Great Fire had devoured over 13,000 homes and 87 parish churches, leaving a smoking crater where the heart of a medieval metropolis once stood. For 4 days, the city had been an inferno. But when the last flames were finally extinguished on Wednesday, September 5th, the real human catastrophe was just beginning. While history tends to focus on the architectural marvels that rose from the ashes, the immediate story for most Londoners was one of raw survival. Somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 people were suddenly homeless and destitute. With everything they owned turned to cinders, they fled the blackened husk of the city. In the fields and moorlands surrounding the ruins, Vazi's makeshift camps sprang up, becoming the temporary home for tens of thousands. This is the often overlooked story of daily life in London's 1666 refugee camps. From the desperate search for food in the Rubel to the king's frantic efforts to prevent mass starvation and outright rebellion. As the fire subsided, a mass exodus was already underway. People who had frantically moved their belongings 4 and 5 times to escape the flames finally gave up and streamed out of the city's gates. The roads were choked with a tide of human misery, men, women, and children carrying what little they'd saved, their faces black with soot, their eyes reflecting the horror of the past few days. They didn't go far. Open spaces just beyond the city walls became the sites of sprawling new settlements. Fields at Islington and Highgate, the wide-open expanse of Moorfields to the north, and Lincoln's Inn Fields to the west were suddenly transformed into cities of canvas and scrap wood. The diarist John Evelyn saw the scene with his own eyes, and he was horrified. He described the fields filled with the homeless, writing that many were without a rag or any necessary utensils, bed or board, reduced to extremist misery and poverty. Imagine a population the size of modern Cambridge or Hartford, suddenly homeless and forced to live in open fields with winter looming. That was the scale of the crisis. Some managed to put up simple tents, maybe using army surplus canvas provided by the king. Most, however, made do with crude shacks built from salvaged timber and whatever else they could scrounge. These weren't organized camps. They were chaotic, sprawling collections of human desperation, growing organically as more and more refugees arrived. The ground underfoot was a mix of damp earth and the fine layer of ash that had settled over everything. For weeks, smoke still hung heavy in the air, a constant, choking reminder of the disaster. The ruins of London weren't a quiet backdrop. They were a living, breathing hazard. Cellars continued to burn for months, and the remaining skeletal walls of buildings would often collapse without warning, a deadly threat to anyone nearby. This was the new, terrifying world for the people of London. For the inhabitants of these camps, every single day was a battle. Life was stripped back to its most basic elements: finding food, securing shelter, and simply staying alive. A typical day began at dawn, not with the familiar sounds of a bustling city, but with the damp chill of an English autumn seeping through thin blankets and makeshift walls. The first and most pressing task was the hunt for food. The fire had completely destroyed London's commercial heart, including the markets and bakeries that fed its people. The entire food supply chain had collapsed. In the immediate aftermath, the only food was what could be scavenged. Groups would venture back into the ruins, a perilous journey into a landscape of destruction. They'd pick through the still-hot rubble of their former homes and shops, searching for anything that might have survived a half-burnt sack of grain, maybe some root vegetables, in a cellar that hadn't completely caved in. These were dangerous expeditions. The ground was unstable, and the air was thick with dust and the stench of decay. King Charles II was acutely aware that a starving population was a rebellious one. Fearing a full-scale uprising, he acted swiftly. On September 5th, the very day the fire was contained, he issued a royal proclamation ordering that great proportions of bread be brought to the outskirts daily. He also commanded the setup of temporary markets around the perimeter of the burnt area, at places like Tower Hill and Smithfield, so farmers could bring their produce to sell. By the following Saturday, these markets were functioning, providing a critical lifeline. But for those who had lost every penny in the flames, these markets were a source of frustration as much as relief. Charity was essential, and a national fund was set up to collect donations for the victims, though distribution was slow and uneven. The second daily struggle was maintaining shelter. The makeshift shacks and tents were in constant need of repair. A strong gust of wind or a heavy downpour could undo a day's work. As autumn wore on, the weather became a formidable enemy. Rain turned the camps into muddy quagmires, and the relentless cold began to bite. The approaching winter was a terrifying prospect for people living with little more than a thin piece of canvas or a few charred boards between them and the elements. Many would succumb to exposure and disease in the coming months, a silent, unrecorded death toll that likely far exceeded the handful of official deaths from the fire itself. While Londoners wrestled with their personal tragedies, King Charles II and his government faced a crisis of staggering proportions. The destruction of the capital wasn't just a humanitarian disaster, it was a profound political threat. In the 17th century, the memory of the English Civil War was still fresh. The monarchy, restored only 6 years earlier, knew just how quickly public order could collapse into open rebellion. Charles II, often remembered as the merry monarch for his lavish court, rose to the occasion with surprising energy. During the fire, he and his brother, James, Duke of York, had been seen on the streets, covered in soot, helping to organize firefighting efforts. This personal involvement continued. Just 2 days after the fire ended, on September 7th, the king rode out 2 more fields, the largest of the refugee camps. He moved among the destitute crowds, offering words of reassurance and personally affirming that the fire was a tragic accident, not a deliberate plot. It was a brilliant bit of public relations, a show of leadership designed to quell the volatile mood. But his actions went far beyond symbolic gestures. The government's response was driven by 2 primary fears: mass starvation and mass rebellion. The daily bread deliveries and the new markets were direct results of this fear. The crown had to be seen to be providing. Charles issued a series of proclamations to manage the chaos. One of the most significant was a decree that all cities and towns whatsoever shall, without any contradiction, receive the said distressed persons and permit them the free exercise of their manual trades. This was a radical and necessary measure, effectively ordering the rest of the country to absorb London's refugee population and disperse the enormous, volatile concentration of homeless people on the capital's doorstep. The government also took steps to secure the property people had saved. Churches that survived were designated as secure storage locations. This was crucial for preventing widespread looting and giving people some hope that they could rebuild. Every action was calculated to restore a semblance of order and to pull the city back from the brink of total social collapse. The king was walking a tightrope, trying to show compassion and competence, while his treasury was empty and the nation was at war with the Dutch. The survival of his reign depended on it. As days turned into weeks, the initial shock gave way to a grim, grinding reality. The camps, born of desperation, quickly became breeding grounds for 2 new threats: disease and violence. With thousands crowded together in unsanitary conditions, without clean water or proper waste disposal, the risk of a public health catastrophe was immense. Coming just 1 year after the Great Plague had killed nearly a quarter of London's population, the fear of another epidemic was palpable. Diseases like dysentery likely spread through the camps, and many of the weakest, the elderly, the very young, and the infirm would have perished, their deaths lost to history. But the more immediate danger was social. The trauma of the fire, combined with the loss of everything, created a powder keg of fear and anger. And in times of crisis, fear seeks a target. The survivors, desperate for an explanation, didn't blame God or an accident. They blamed foreigners. England was at war with the Dutch and had a long-standing rivalry with France. Anti-Catholic sentiment was rampant. In the paranoid atmosphere of the camps, these tensions exploded. Rumors spread like wildfire that French and Dutch immigrants were marching on the camps to murder the refugees. Panic erupted. Mobs poured out of the fields, attacking any foreigner they encountered. Shops owned by immigrants were looted, and people were beaten or killed in the streets. The violence became so severe that the king had to deploy troops to protect foreign embassies and restore order. This fury needed a scapegoat, and had found one in a man named Robert Hubert. Hubert was a simple-minded French watchmaker. Shortly after the fire, he was arrested and confessed to starting it. His story was a mess of contradictions. First, He claimed to have started a fire in Westminster, which the flames never even reached. Then he changed his story, claiming he'd thrown a fireball through the window of the bakery on Pudding Lane, where the fire began. He said he was a spy, an agent of the Pope. The confession was absurd. Hubert was physically disabled, and likely couldn't have thrown anything. The bakery owner testified that his building didn't even have a window where Hubert described, and the final, irrefutable proof of his innocence would come later. The captain of the ship he arrived on testified that Hubert hadn't even set foot in London until 2 days after the fire had already started. But none of these facts mattered. The public demanded justice, and Hubert was the perfect villain. French, and he'd confessed. Despite the judge and jury having serious doubts, he was convicted based on his own impossible story. On October 27, 1666, Robert Hubert was hanged at T. He was the official, final victim of the Great Fire of London, executed for a crime he could not possibly have committed, a sacrifice made to appease the rage of a broken city. The refugee camps were never meant to be permanent. They were a raw, temporary scar on the landscape. As autumn deepened, the authorities knew the camps couldn't be sustained. The combination of cold, disease, and social unrest was just too dangerous. The king's proclamation encouraging other towns to accept refugees was the first step in a slow For many, this meant leaving London for good. A survey conducted years later suggested that as much as a quarter of the city's population never returned. For those who remained, the situation was complex. Wealthier citizens found new lodging, but faced outrageous rent hikes from opportunistic landlords. For the poorest, the future was far more uncertain. Evidence suggests that some of these miserable shacks and hovels were still occupied for years. It wasn't until 1674, a full 8 years after the fire, that an official order was passed to tear down the last of the shanty towns. What became of the people displaced a second time is largely unknown. While this human drama played out, the monumental task of rebuilding began. Almost immediately, grand plans were presented to the king. Christopher Wren, John Evelyn, and Robert Hooke all submitted radical redesigns, proposing a city of wide boulevards and grand plazas inspired by Paris and Rome. But these utopian visions collided with messy reality. The city needed to be rebuilt quickly, and thousands of citizens, from wealthy merchants to humble shopkeepers, still owned the plots of land where their lives had stood. They had no interest in giving up their property for a grand civic scheme. Ultimately, pragmatism won out. The radical plans were rejected. Instead, the government passed the Rebuilding of London Act. In 1667, this landmark legislation opted for practical reform over radical redesign. The new London would be built on essentially the same medieval street plan, but with crucial improvements. Key streets were widened, and the most hazardous alleys were removed. Most importantly, the act mandated that all new buildings be constructed from brick or stone, not wood, creating a safer, more fire-resistant city. The London that emerged from the ashes was not the perfectly ordered city of Wren's dreams, but a more resilient and recognizably modern version of the one that had burned. The story of the Great Fire is often told as a tale of destruction and glorious rebirth of a medieval city of wood, giving way to a modern city of stone. But this narrative leaves out the most important part: the people. For the tens of thousands of Londoners who found themselves homeless in the autumn of 1666, the aftermath was not a story of architectural progress. It was a brutal struggle for survival in some of Europe's first large-scale refugee camps. They endured hunger, cold, disease, and the terror of mob violence. They scavenged in the ruins of their own lives and fell victim to the dark impulse to find a scapegoat in times of crisis. The king and his government, driven by a fear of total anarchy, responded with a mixture of charity and ruthless pragmatism, feeding the hungry while orchestrating a judicial murder to appease public rage. The camps at Moorfields and Islington are long gone, paved over by the relentless expansion of London. But their story is a powerful reminder that the true cost of any disaster is always measured in human suffering. The legacy of the Great Fire is written not just in the elegant churches of Christopher Wren, but in the forgotten experiences of the thousands who lost everything and had to find a way to live on the ashes of their world. What would you have done to survive in the fields outside London in 1666? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.